Hi, everybody. We have a marvelous set of 14 chapters. I called it Words for Sale, chapters 14 to 26 of Phineas Finn, the Irish member. La parole a été donnée à l'homme pour cacher sa pensée. That's attributed to Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. What it means is speech has been given to men so that they can conceal their thoughts. What a cornucopia of rich, suggestive, political, sexual, social, and familial experience has Trollope put before us in these chapters of Phineas Finn. The theme I'm going to trace, the dramatized and thoughtful variations on the intersections of love and politics and in these chapters is but one of those which Trollope is intent on exploring. The major theme of the book may be regarded as the intertwined education of two ambitious and at first in love, well, sort of, upper-class people, Phineas Finn and Lady Laura Standish. Parallels and contrasts are set up between them and two closely attached complex characters, Laura's cousin, Violet Effingham, and the fierce suitor to marry Violet, Laura's brother and Phineas's friend, Oswald, Lord Chiltern. All four are embedded in or emerge from context, stick with other tertiary, if I may call them that, characters. The rigid, wealthy Scotsman, Robert Kennedy, Laura's husband, the political man of integrity, an oxymoron, Joshua Monk on his way to becoming Phineas's true mentor, the working and or lower middle class Mr. and Mrs. Bunce, a labor union man and Phineas's landlady, Mr. Clarkson, moneylender, in whose toils Phineas's compatriot and friend, Anglo-Irish politician, Lawrence Fitzgibbon, has entangled Phineas. Not to omit further important politicians, Barrington Erle, Liberal Whig Party fixer, and Mr. Turnbull, radical activist, shall we call him, modeled on a real politician with similar political beliefs in the era, John Bright. Let us note that in these chapters, the Pallisers, Lady Glencora and Plantagenet, play a smaller role than Lord Benford, Laura and Chiltern's father and Violet's uncle, soon to be Phineas's patron, a power-hungry journalist, Quintus Slide of the People's Banner, and Lawrence's sharp tongue, luckily sufficiently provided for, unmarried sister, Aspasia Fitzgibbon. I cannot mention everybody who speaks words in a self or socially revealing way, or we'd be here all night. The theme we'll follow is that of speech, talk, words, the content and meaning of what the characters say to one another, and just as important, what they omit to say, what they're silent about, but whose reality is left unarticulated. Everyone who understands what's happening knows, as of course does our narrator. And if we're using 20th century conventions, a presence we may stubbornly call our implied author. But if we listen to Trollope and drop our own contemporary pretensions, our seemingly benignly ironic storyteller, whom I think descends from the Henry Fielding we find in Tom Jones, The History of a Foundling. To read Phineas Finn with the most enjoyment, I also advise remembering the American singer Leonard Cohen's song Everybody Knows. The two matchless scenes I'll begin with, which require some narrative and thematic context, dramatize when Phineas tries ever so hard but fails to speak, and then he speaks to little purpose. We will then turn briefly to Laura, Chiltern, and then Violet and Laura, whom for the purposes of this talk and seeing how the theme of what's said and what isn't works out in these chapters becomes our other three principles. Okay, very early on in the book, we were told, as Phineas says in these chapters, he had been sent to Parliament on the special ground of his eloquence. We've been able to slowly realize that Lady Laura Standish at the time was drawn to Phineas at one of her father's dinner parties. She then recommended Phineas to her cousin, Barrington Erle, the fixer, who at the Reform Club, which it seems Lawrence Fitzgibbon enabled Phineas to join, told Phineas of the rotten borough of Loughshane. This borough is an easy, inexpensive win, since it's controlled by the Earl of Tulla, for whom Phineas's father, as Tulla's longtime doctor and friend, successfully appealed on behalf of his son as Tulla's candidate. From the first moment in the novel, where we witness Phineas encounter Earl, Trollope has also rung a bell that Phineas's Irish background matters when it comes to party line voting. To Earl's disgust, Phineas declares, "If I go into Parliament, I should go as a sound liberal, not to support a party but to do the best I can for the country. By the time of our chosen chapters, we also understand that allowing voters to use secret ballots in the elections has become an important controversial issue. At Loughlinter, though, we find Phineas is yet a persuadable young man and has been led to agree with Monk and other powerful people who seem to be befriending him and whose support he will need in order to obtain a remunerative office, which he desperately needs, that the coming reform bill will have done enough to extend the franchise. For reasons all are mostly silent about, the Whigs are correct in wanting to pass this bill without the secret ballot. The one reason offered here and throughout Trollope's novel, voiced by Monk, is it's cowardly and unmanly not to vote openly. What all is silent about in the novel is these upper and middle class people and landlords who control these boroughs can easily kick any tenant off their property or subordinate out of a position if he votes differently than the powerful man wants. To change the legal rights here would go directly against the economic and social interests of many of their wealthy voting constituencies and them too, including, say, Fitzgibbon. So if the actual realities are not broached in the debate on the ballot, what is? Let's look at chapter 20. I assigned this book twice to American college students, and both times somebody in the class took us to the chapter. They just marveled at it. It begins with Phineas practicing his speech. He could not continue to keep his seat unless he spoke. He had put there that he might speak. We watch him decide what are the heads of the topics he will deal with, tax his memory for apt quotations. He had learned verbatim the words which he intended to utter under each heading. He has thought about how speech is spontaneous and that he cannot predict what will be said. So he has invented intercalatory parts he will insert if need be. He has worked very hard, going over and over what he will say. He did know what Monk's line of argument would be. No evil can come from daring to vote publicly, but not that Monk would say everything that he planned to say. Phineas also thought he would give a turn to his speech which would crush Turnbull. But then what does Turnbull do? He attacks Monk personally ad hominem. Nothing about the issue or turn Monk gave it. What is needed then is a defense of Monk as a sincere, uncorrupted man. And it seems on the spur of the moment, Phineas, so emotionally confused in front of prestigious men by the demand he put himself forward that he can barely see the people around him, cannot do it. Earl must turn to Mr. Bonteen, a weathered politician who has no problem defending Monk's patriotism, one of the words used here, but apparently with little warmth. As he sits there in the chamber, Phineas feels Monk is looking round at him as though with reproach. How to endure this? Phineas desperately needs a validation that shows understanding of what he has gone through. Lady Laura is the only person who will understand the failure as a significant personal matter, concede with him that he has failed, and excuse him on partial but real grounds that he has thought too much about it, and thus buoy him up on the grounds of inexperience, which means he will be better at it next time. He finds her alone in the TV serial, sitting in the dark, dressed in black. With her there, Phineas can perceive from the course of the debate that if he spoke at all, his speech must have been very different from what he had intended. Unfortunately, the conversation then degenerates when Laura brings up her own personal obsessions, which at that point take the form of defending Kennedy, who would, she said, pronounce justly on what happened. Luckily, Violet comes in and counters by voicing a reality. Mr. Kennedy never tells one anything. Our second scene, Phineas's first speech, arises directly from what seems to be a mass demonstration of working men with police everywhere, during which people are angered by the knowledge that their gigantic petition has just been turned aside by Parliament, incited and excited by window breaking, stone throwing, and after another speech on behalf of the ballot, by Turnbull coming out among them. The reader is pulled in personally by the dramatized example of Mr. Bunce unfairly taken into custody. We have heard Mr. Bunce say he must go out because if people like him do not, there will never be a secret ballot. And now we hear his insistence how he has broken no law, irritates an already irritated sergeant. Phineas now discovers he can elicit no useful sympathy on behalf of the demonstrators, which of course here means Mr. Bunce. Then by the time the speechifying again begins, the purity of his liberal principles have again been jarred or undermined, this time by Mr. Slyde's tempting offer to Phineas that he write vigorously on behalf of reform for the people's ballot. What's interesting is how Phineas is torn while he sits listening to Palliser, supposedly listening, say that the ballot is now beside the point. For the bill is for the franchise and borough reform. And then Phineas becomes restless as he barely tolerates a Mr. Weston pleading against any reform with all the old arguments. Twice he was on his legs before Mr. Weston finished his slow harangue and risked ridicule. The name Weston may well be an allusion to the retrograde mad Tory squire of Tom Jones. Phineas is finally recognized, stands up in front of them all, and has much on his side. A powerful and pleasant voice, don't underestimate that. A handsome presence, modulated manners, friends in the house who are anxious that he should do well. But he finds that again he forgets what he thought he had at his fingers' ends and begins to go from platitude to platitude, pressing on with nothing to say for the bill except what hundreds had said before, until a dangerous hope tells him he could still save himself from ignominy by the eloquence of his invective against the police. Well, I love him for this, but now listen to what he says. He could not explain his idea that the people out of the House had as much right to express their opinion in favor of the ballot as members in the House had to express theirs against it, and that animosity had been shown to the people by the authorities because they had so expressed their opinion. Then he attempted to tell the story of Mr. Bunce in a light and airy way. He failed and sat down in the middle of it. Phineas is cheered apparently as new members were then usually cheered, but he feels suicidal and can keep himself under control only because just afterwards Mr. Monk joins him and tells him he has not made an ass of himself, that is, in any special degree. One of the lessons learned here in both scenes is the centrality of personal feelings, alliances, and identifications. Far from not mattering, they are shown here to be at the core of the political stances, which are also shown to be a function of the kind of personality each person is. How does talk, what is said and what is not said, work its way through the education of Lady Laura Standish, now Kennedy, and now just begun? She has been deluded by adhering to the political talk she's heard all around her, and has refused or been unable to see that no action, not even that of secondary influence, belongs to her unless she's attached to a man who permits this. We are told she scorns the vote and presumably rhetoric on behalf of women's rights. I take it she's perhaps overly proud of her class identification. Fitting Trollope's theme, in Laura's way of talking to or about Mr. Kennedy, we see her looking to voice principles and not personalities. She assumes she can ignore the sexual aspects of marriage. Now, Sundays with Kennedy as her husband are teaching her neither reality, bodily and social, her being a woman and now a married woman, can be ignored. A lot has been written about the cage of femininity Laura finds herself locked inside. It's true the reader of this novel might well have been aware the year 1866, when Phineas was composed, John Stuart Mill presented the first women's suffrage petition to Parliament. And in 1867, when Phineas Finn began publication in installments, Mill introduced the first parliamentary debate on the subject. Her brother Chiltern is a troubling figure. Among the first things we're told about him are Chiltern nearly strangled one man and nearly killed another with his fists. Listen to his reply early on to Laura's on how to persuade Violet to accept him as her husband. Lady Laura, tell her the sort of life which you would live with her. Tell her that all is changed. Chiltern, am I to lie to her? He too is quickly placed as to how he uses language. His letters are comically short. He never wastes a word. We learn he has no respect for politicians. He sees what they do as dishonest and so will not go into politics. Thus, Brentford's borough is open for Phineas to take. In the continuum of masculinity in the novel, he contrasts to Phineas' other male associate, Fitzgibbon. The last thing Chiltern is capable of is fleecing Phineas through manipulation, as we've just seen Fitzgibbon do. But what is his life's work then? He says he can or will do nothing but hunt. So Trollope shows him hunting. In chapter 24, the Willingford Bull, his behavior is brutal. Towards the horses, violent and unnecessarily cruel. The horse began to tremble in every muscle. That's as he closes in on him. And towards Phineas, irresponsible. By the hunt's end, the horse shoulder is smashed and the horse killed. Yet by Chilton's bedside, Phineas becomes very fond of his patient. I find how the character is presented and treated especially troubling due to why Trollope excuses him. It's more than he's a male and males are like that. Chilton is excused on the grounds of his rank, that is, that he is heir to the property. Given this portrait, his sister Lady Laura's silences and words used to Violet, her cousin, to whom she professes to be a loyal women friend, are strongly problematic. Laura's reasons why Violet should marry Chilton are: he loves her. He is someone for whom she felt strong affection and gratitude as a child. Marrying him would help the Standish family economically, and maybe Chilton's character too. Violet's replies include, all your reasons are reasons why he should marry me, not reasons I should marry him. I'm not a man, and I must take care of myself. The wrong side of the post for a woman is very much the wrong side. I am afraid to be his wife. The risk would be so great. It's more than that she does not want to enact life as any man's dear duck of a thing, but she does not want to be subjected to this man's proven violence. We might be troubled about the whole portrait of Violet. At first, her talk, especially in these chapters, is explicit candor itself. But if we read carefully, Trollope is already beginning a turnaround similar to the one we saw in Can You Forgive Her, where a young woman, Lady Glencora, who protested having a man she felt nothing for and did not seem compatible with, imposed upon her as her husband, became a smiling, almost jeering advocate of violating women's, Alice Vavasor's, autonomy. Violet Effingham merely, I use the adverb ironically, begins to fall silent. So may be said to stay within the character and norms for speech we are watching in this book. We could say about Lady Laura, her character floors naivete, when you think about how she also neglected to take into consideration what contracts and legal demands men could make and she none. I suggest more important here is her intense loyalty to her brother as heir, and Trollope's depiction of the relationships of brothers and sisters across the novel. With respect to Violet, what we are seeing is a woman who does not care enough about her woman friend, does not think Violet counts as much as the males around them do. Laura has sold herself to pay her brother's debts and is willing to sell Violet as wealthy heiress to attempt to make sure Chilton will not run out of money. I conclude with a few variations on how the use of language in this novel and others by Trollope reveal important truths about his characters and the norms and values promulgated in his books. Here in this chapter, there is the famous Mr. Clarkson's "Do be punctual," said by Trollope in his autobiography to be an abbreviated memory of a moneylender who chased Trollope over an unpaid tailor's bill, which grew to large proportions when Trollope was a young man in London. The man would come and stand behind my chair, whispering to me always the same words. Now I wish you would be punctual. Note how polite Mr. Clarkson often is, and how he uses this courtesy of his to weasel his way into Phineas's private lodgings. But how, at the same time, when Phineas brings up any aspect of the truth of what has happened, Mr. Clarkson quickly moves to exclamations of surprise and protest intended to silence Phineas. For example, Phineas, driven by a wall of exclamations, finally says, "The fact is, Mr. Clarkson, I have never had one penny of consideration for that bill," and to which Clarkson produces a cascading clamor, "Oh, Mr. Finn, Mr. Finn." Whatever happens to these sums of money, Mr. Clarkson has the legal right to collect what's been said to be what's owed on the bill's face from either Lawrence or Phineas. Now he knows he has no handle with which to compel the ever-elusive Lawrence. The parallel here is with the secret ballot. The important question is what the law is and what custom allows or decrees, not which person got what, or the specifics of any voter's behavior. More briefly, Barrington Erle is analogously clever at turning aside accusations he's not a true liberal. Heart should never have anything to do with politics, should it? Is the silencer he asks of all people, Mr. Kennedy. Blackstone, among others, argues sympathy is the basis of equity. With Mr. Slide, we watch Phineas only beginning to grasp the nature of the bargain made to Phineas in Slide's first proposition. Phineas's reaction to Mrs. Spacey Fitzgibbon tells us about how performative these characters are. In our chapters, Phineas meets her at Lady Baldock's, where she moves directly over to him, alas, too late to tell him not to lend any money to her brother. His reaction is to tell Violet, "She has taken my breath away now." Why? He's astonished at the direct way she speaks to him upon meeting him, quote, without any preliminaries, end quote. In his autobiography and elsewhere, Trollope insists he's in the business of fashioning and selling words for money. In a very interesting letter to one of his closer women friends and a relative, after reading a draft of some sort which he has written, he tells her there's a difference between writing for yourself and writing for money. There is some special kind of manipulative inhibition involved when your purpose is to persuade people to hand over enough money to make a profit. In his writing about his writing, Trollope shows himself to be remarkably self-aware. He thinks and acts towards his texts as words he is working with. I quote, "The language used should be as ready and as efficient a conductor of the mind of the writer, of the mind of the writer to the mind of the reader, as is the electric spark which passes from one battery to another." In these chapters, we find Phineas at the beginning of learning his analogous trade in the very hard give and take situation of parliamentary debate, and specifically what it is that most of his listeners will listen to and for. And he is surrounded by characters who are shown to use language in a less and equivalent or more self-aware manner, whose uses of language, because of his need to get along with them, he must understand. And as he learns to understand them, so can we learn to understand more. Okay, that's the end. I do want to give the questions for breakout sessions. So here they are. I have 5. I hope not too many, because my talk is not too long. Do you think Trollope has dramatized the true basis of experience a politician will have as central to political life? Is he really dramatizing what's central to political life? Is Phineas's sense of himself as having different identities plausible? He really does in these chapters. How about Trollope's descriptive or writing dialogue powers? Where do his description or dialogue impress you most?
No.
Okay. Did you find the love stories well integrated with the political ones? Of all the people he meets, who is most truly helpful to Phineas? Does anyone help Lady Laura for real?
Yeah.
And then my last one, if you've seen the Phineas Finn episodes in the 1975 Pallisers, do you think they were particularly effective in dramatizing this phase of the novel? Phineas trying to speak, the early phase of Laura's mistaken marriage, the demonstration, Violet as a believable character. How do you think Chilton is presented? What scenes stand out in your memory? And I want to tell one more thing. Dominic always puts the paper up on the net. So I have included a transcript of 2 scenes from the Pallisers and a description of a 3rd one. And the reason I've included is this. Simon Raven makes explicit what Trollope leaves implicit in the added scenes. So they're very interesting to read. The first one, Phineas is returning from Ireland on a train with Lawrence Fitzgibbon, and we're shown how the Whigs party's silence and inaction on the central issues are central to the self-issues of Fitzgibbon. Fitzgibbon gets very angry at Phineas and tells him he's living a lie. Lest we not pick up on the realities, Raven also offers a very teacher-like scene between Madame Max and Phineas Finn. They're sitting on a bench, and we hear them going over the issues and matching Priory. They do it pretty well. The 3rd scene I haven't typed out, but I did describe for you, is another wholly invented, ironic one on part 9. The other 2 are in part 10 of the Pallisers. This makes visible how class does and does not count as power. Okay, in the film adaptation, Mrs. Bunce wakes Phineas up in the middle of the night of the demonstration. Mr. Phineas, Mr. Phineas. That's Mr. Bunce. We see Donald McCann at the local police station learn that his various legal axioms for his say-so will not free Bunce, but rather a big enough bribe. It's a kind of drama of incipient male cronyism that he presents for us. And I'll give for you now, because it's only a sentence in the section. In Trollope's Phineas Finn, we're instead quickly told that it took Phineas weeks to try to help free Bunce. And then it was not Phineas who did anything, but time in the process of law. Then Bunce wanted some revenge. His pride and self-esteem had been hurt, and he tries to sue. But Mr. Lowe, Phineas's previous mentor, the lawyer, tried to discourage Bunce from wasting his time and money, but Bunce wouldn't listen. So you see the contrast between the TV one and the one in the book. Okay, now I'm done.